Charmaine, it's 11:46, so we could certainly start.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Research Talks. My name is Charmaine Dean, and I'm the Vice President, Research and International at the University of Waterloo. I'm really pleased to welcome you this morning. I would like to acknowledge that our work, takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The main campus at the University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to the Six Nations, and it includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. We have an Indigenous office at the University of Waterloo, led by Jean Becker, and all our active work towards reconciliation across all our campuses, not just the main campus, through research, learning, teaching, community building, is centralized within that office. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the final set of in the series of COVID, a year of COVID. So we've had a couple of other events in this series. The first examined disparities, inequities, and inequalities. The second focused on innovative research. And you may remember members of our campus and elsewhere have spoken in both of these series on how they contribute to these two areas. The whole teaching area has been completely transformed through this year of COVID. And today we complete the series with a discussion on the transformational changes to pedagogy and to work that has been driven by the pandemic through a look at teaching and learning. I'm so pleased to have with us David Davidi, our Associate Vice President Academic at the University of Waterloo, to lead this event today. I'll pass it over to you, David, to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Charmaine. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So as Charmaine has just noted, in this final session on a year of COVID-19, we've invited 4 speakers. All are connected to the University of Waterloo in different ways, and all have expertise in the area of teaching and learning, but that expertise also comes from very different perspectives. So I think we should have an interesting discussion today and hear a lot of different, usefully different perspectives. So the way things are going to unfold is I'll invite each of our speakers to present. Then we'll have some time for questions and answers, questions from the audience. So I'd invite you to inject your questions whenever you have them into the Q&A session on the website. If there's a particular panelist you'd like to direct the question to, it would be very helpful if you indicated that when you put the question into the Q&A box. I should also mention that we're recording today's event for the people who couldn't make it for our synchronous event today. We may hear something about synchronous and asynchronous delivery in the course of the session today. But anyway, the people who couldn't make it for the synchronous part will still have access to it because we'll be posting it onto the Research Talks webpage. So let me start by telling you a little bit about today's panelists. The first is Claire Birmingham from Claire has led the Writing and Communication Center here at the University of Waterloo through several big changes since 2014. As director, she's focused on trying to build the WCC as an equitable writer and speaker-centered space at Waterloo with flexible and integrated programs. Claire is also an alumna of the University of Waterloo. She has a PhD from Waterloo and in fact was one of the nominees for the Alumni Gold Medal when she graduated recently. And she currently serves as the president of the Canadian Writing Centers Association. Diana Scrilo is the incoming math faculty teaching fellow and is the current director of the Master of Actuarial Science program, as well as serving as a continuing lecturer in the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science. She's been teaching at the University of Waterloo since 2007 and is an expert on innovative teaching and assessment techniques. So she'll give us a bit of an inside the classroom, well, not inside the classroom perspective on what's happened over the past year, I think. Roland D'Souza received his Bachelor of Software Engineering with joint honors in applied mathematics from Waterloo, and is currently a doctoral candidate in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, where he researches nonlinear control systems. Roland is known for initiating improvements in educational content and delivery and connecting well with students, including mentoring first-year software engineering students. He has won departmental and faculty level awards for his work as a TA, including the Sir Sanford Fleming Teaching Assistantship Excellence Award in 2018. And in 2021, he was awarded the Amit Admina Chakma Award for exceptional teaching by a student, in part for his adaptability during the COVID-19 pandemic. And our fourth panelist is Travis Ratnam. He is the CEO and co-founder of Knowledge Hook, an instructional guidance system that helps students learn more effectively by recommending expert-designed teaching activities based on data collected on each student's learning needs. Travis is an electrical engineering graduate from Waterloo, and today he will have two colleagues joining him for his presentation. Noor Aslam is the Director of Human Resources, and Davina Vyasval is the Product Manager at Knowledge Hook. So I'd like to welcome all of our panelists, Claire, Diana, Roland, and Travis, to Research Talks, and to thank them for taking time from their obviously busy schedules and sharing their insights with us today. So first up, I'd like to invite Claire to tell us a little bit about her work.
Okay, let me just make sure I'm sharing here. Can someone confirm for me that the slides are being seen in sort of full view?
I can see them, Claire.
We can see them. It's the presentation side, though, I think.
Oh,
So
okay.
the notes and everything, yeah.
Okay, so we'll do the regular presenter view. Oh, sorry.
Perfect, yeah. Now
Great.
it's on the presenter side.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. It has been an historic year, one that has impacted teaching and learning activities on campus to a significant degree. Students have been separated from their professional learning and scholarly communities. Many have had to devise new ways to manage new kinds of learning and their research activities, and to do it while managing an overlap of family responsibilities. And in all of this, technology, of course, has made access to learning both harder and easier. It's really astounding, I think, to think back to more than a year ago and to the rapid shifts that moved our campuses to virtual learning, teaching, and student support, and turned us into a virtual writing center almost overnight. The title of this talk, Access and Affect, describes the two principles that we kept at the front of mind through this last year. Through the lens of access, we considered students' technology, bandwidth, location, time zones, the communities they had access to, and their needs as learners and writers. And through the lens of affect, we considered the multitude of anxieties and emotions that students were grappling with at the peripheries of their writing and speaking activities, and which emerged through their writing and speaking processes. So while we provide a range of programs at the Writing and Communication Center, it's often the way that we do our work that surprises people. Our writing and speaking are critically integrated with the way that knowledge is made. So how a student composes a text, whether written, oral, or visual, is shaped by their awareness of context and convention, by their social activities, by their past experiences with other composing activities, by their confidence and apprehension about the task, by the time and space they've given to the task, and by their self-awareness of how they're making meaning and communicating. Our job, in essence, is to talk them through it, to support them as they think and explore their ideas and how they're communicating them, to help them figure out their goals and the roadmap and the process. It's a conversation, one that encourages metacognition and writing transfer. Students who are more aware of the strategies they're using can apply them in other contexts. And students' agency increases as they become more confident in their ability to produce a text and more confident in making choices and decisions for their writing and how they engage with other people's writing, research and work as well. So a framework that was put forward by Helen Sword as a result of research that she conducted with academics has been influential on our programming over the last few years. And it really helps illustrate the means through which we have attended to access and affect in the past year. The base habits refer to 4 facets that successful academic writers attend to, and they've helped us consider how our programs are meeting students' needs in these various areas, as well as understand how classroom practices can support students develop holistically. During the pandemic, we wanted to ensure that students had access to the support that they needed, and that the support was sensitive to the complex emotional landscapes that students were navigating. The base habits as developed by Sword are behavioral, artisanal, social, and emotional. Behavioral habits refer to sort of what we do to make writing and composing successful. So having and sticking to a schedule and a plan, focusing without getting distracted, and persevering through difficult stages of thinking and writing, and committing to a revising process. Artisanal habits refer to the craft or the skill of writing, or presenting, or creating, for example, a podcast. It would include attention to clarity, to structure, to tone, convention, the ins and outs of how you place words beside each other and connect ideas and connect to research. Social writing habits refer to the ways that people write alongside or with other people. Writing is not solitary, although it appears that way in lots of media. So talking through ideas, using a writing group for motivation or discussion, handing a draft to someone to review, and give feedback on. And then emotional writing habits, which refer to the feelings that people have about writing and how they manage those emotions. So anxiety, confidence, apprehension, worry, unease, discomfort, fear, all of these impact how effective writers are. To support students' behavioral and artisanal habits, we needed to ensure that they had continued access to our services. So in appointments, workshops, and programs, we have conversations about these habits all the time, about planning, carving out time to write, reducing procrastination, actually doing the writing and making those connections and increasing clarity, etc. But conversations about the process and the craft of writing were possible only if students were able to connect to us virtually. So we thought about access in 2 ways. First, how can we broaden when and how we're working so that students can reach us when they need to? And second, how do we ensure that the teaching and coaching that we provide can be understood by a diverse group of students, from those with accessibility needs to students who are learning English while they study? For these and other students, having content delivered in a variety of accessible modes and the ability to review material multiple times is really important. Virtual appointments were already available to students before the pandemic. In these, students can use video and chat. There's a shared white space where they can paste their text and it can be manipulated by them and the instructor at the same time. However, some students didn't have webcams at first, or they had low bandwidth. Or we were talking to students who were located in areas where power outages and other issues made online access very difficult. And so we were working with what they had. We used phone and email as we needed to. And we offered appointments from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. most days for access in a range of time zones. As we heard from students over the year and understood their needs better, we also introduced a more formal asynchronous email tutoring pilot program, and we began conducting research alongside it as well. For virtual workshops and programs, open captioning and accessible transcripts helped us to ensure that all students could access the material. And the goal was to create not just accessible workshops, but also opportunities for there to be kind of a friendly connection, some sort of personal connection for students, even in an asynchronous kind of format. Eventually, we moved from kind of video workshops to a more asynchronous workshop platform that's accessible to screen readers and that allows for more interaction as students review material and reflect on the content. Virtual graduate programs combine synchronous and asynchronous elements. So these are the programs that support dissertation writing, for example. And these were really to balance the importance of creating that writing community with also against those challenges of childcare and homeschooling and time zones and bandwidth that students were struggling with. So in terms of behavioral and social habits, creating virtual writing communities was really important. The loss of research and writing communities as a result of the pandemic was felt keenly by graduate students, postdocs, and faculty almost immediately. Our popular grad and faculty writing groups, both Writing and Communication Center led and volunteer led, migrated online into the Learn space, and they've been critical spaces for connection, community, and motivation. Writing groups provide a sense of continuity, structure, and accountability for participants. As well, just before the pandemic, WCC staff partnered with Faculty of Health instructors to explore how the base writing habits apply to first-year students in a writing intensive course. Dr. Nadine Fladd, Dr. Nicole Westland Stewart, who's now at Lakehead, worked with Dr. Wade Wilson and doctoral candidate David Drury to understand how base habits impact undergraduate student self-efficacy as writers. They found that students' behavioral habits are in pretty good shape, but they tend not to use social habits in their writing processes. These social habits, like peer review, writing groups, and conversations about writing, contribute to their success as writers. And during a pandemic, they also provide really important spaces for community and connection. So to encourage undergraduate students to build social habits, we experimented with a variety of formats, including running writing groups over social media for a period of time. We now host what we call PJ-friendly writing groups and a peer-led writing hub in arts on Teams. And these programs have a dedicated undergraduate following, and they're led by trained undergraduate peer tutors. The connections they foster are crucial for establishing rapport and building confidence, and their regular schedule helps with motivation, accountability, and time management. So throughout all of this, we were really aware of the affective landscape that was impacting students, both graduate and undergraduate. The Spring 2020 survey that was run by the University of Waterloo demonstrated that many students were dealing with challenges and difficulties early in the pandemic. It confirmed what we were hearing in appointments and other programs. Undergraduate students were having difficulty staying engaged and motivated, or were working in spaces that weren't conducive to learning. Graduate students suddenly stalled in their research activities, were unsure about what to do next. There had been and has been a generalized anxiety about the COVID virus, and the isolation of the year has affected students' mental health. For some of our students, these anxieties hit closer to home as family members and friends became sick or passed away, sometimes from across great distances. And alongside the pandemic, racialized students experienced trauma as the world seemed to suddenly wake up to racist and colonial violence and systems as a result of a series of murders and genocidal events. So in WCC appointments and in many programs, students connect with staff instructors and student tutors about their successes and their challenges. During the pandemic, making space for students to share their feelings and emotions about their work became even more important. We were aware that for many students, we were one of the few opportunities for individual connection. And as a team, we talked about the importance of making this space for students. And we reinforced that if our position was their primary contact with campus, this meant that we needed to be more mindful of the potential need to connect students with other services, such as counseling services or accessibility. The links between students' affective states and their abilities to learn and compose is outlined in research on cognition, emotion and cognition, emotion and problem solving. Affect interrupts and motivates writing, and affective dispositions are engaged in writing transfer and self-efficacy. As a result, we use such strategies as motivational scaffolding, which supports students affectively as they engage in more difficult tasks. And as well, trauma-informed writing pedagogy means that we recognize when trauma might manifest in appointments, but we don't make assumptions or have expectations about who may have experienced trauma. And it also means that we remain intentional about staff and tutor wellness and safe care, which is something we focused a lot on in the last year. Our Eunice teaching philosophy outlines these approaches, and it also emphasizes equity and anti-racism in our pedagogy. As conversations about systemic racism increase, students have increased awareness about how their identities and languages and success are impacted by ways of knowing and writing that are grounded in white Western values. We're having these conversations with students as well, supporting them in navigating the impositions of a white rhetorical tradition and white linguistic structures to make choices and to wield this knowledge in ways that upholds and values their identities and their experiences. So our rapid shift in response to campus closing down turned into a process of continuous improvement as we adjusted and honed programs and services in the new virtual landscape. Staying in conversation with students was important as well, and we listened to all of their feedback and comments. We were also grateful for SOLA, Senior Online Learning Assistant co-op students, who helped us with the implementation of many of these virtual shifts. As we return to campus, we're going to ensure that we retain the practices and programs that benefit all students, regardless of where they are and how they're feeling. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire. So next, I'd like to turn the floor over to Diana. Are you talking, Diana? Because if you are, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. Apparently I have to turn on my mic and my video before I share my screen or it won't let me. Thanks very much. Let's try that again. Can you see my slides okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me as well. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. And I love what Claire said about retaining the programs that benefit students the most. And that's what I'm going to focus on, how we can bring what we started doing a little bit differently during the pandemic back to the classroom with us. And in particular, I'm going to focus on assessments. So I want to talk about what assessment is for in the first place, what changed when we moved into online teaching, and most importantly, what we can bring back with us. First of all, I want to start about thinking about what the purpose of assessment is at all. I have this catchphrase that I often say, which is that assessment is curriculum. How you assess your students is going to be how they interpret the curriculum to be. If you want them to know something, you should test them on that thing. But there are different points at which assessment plays into the course experience. So I think about diagnostic, formative, and summative assessment, and they should flow into each other. They should be similar. The diagnostic should prepare for the formative, and the formative should prepare for the summative. Just a little bit of a definition, the goal with diagnostic assessment is for students to learn what they already know, usually at the beginning of the course or possibly throughout, and usually non-graded, just for the student's own feedback. And then we have formative assessment, which is the goal of that is to assess what students are learning and how they're going, but also to provide feedback to them about how they're doing. That will be ongoing throughout the term, and it could be graded or it could be ungraded. And then finally, summative at the end of the term would be an assessment of what the students have learned throughout the course. That generally is graded, and there may not be as much of a feedback component. It might be sort of just for the instructor to see what the students have learned. And again, all of these assessment types should flow into each other and be aligned with each other. As well, I want to talk about the idea of Bloom's taxonomy of learning. You may or may not have heard of this, but a very brief introduction is that there's different depths at which someone can know something. At the very base, it's just remembering something. But then above that, we have understanding and applying. And then even higher order thinking skills include creating, evaluating, and analyzing. So that's taking what you know and applying it to a completely new situation where you're critiquing something or creating your own. Lots of these skills are extremely necessary, and it's important to assess students on those higher order skills, not just on how much they can remember. So with that in mind, I like to think of 5 principles that drive good assessment design. And first of all is the word up here, authentic. And that doesn't mean making sure it's the student who's doing the work. That's not what authentic assessment means. Authentic assessment means something realistic, something meaningful, not just busy work, not just, here's 100 math problems, solve them all, and they're all very similar. So something maybe that students would actually do in the workplace, or something that actually has meaning and value to the students. Next, we have achievable. You want to make sure that your assessments are actually possible to do. If you have a test where every single question is very, very difficult, that's going to not be a very good experience for a student, and they're not going to be able to demonstrate their best work. So there should be a range of difficulty level on any assessment that you have. Next, aligned with learning goals. So this goes back to what I was saying before with assessment is curriculum. If there are things that you want your students to know, you need to assess them on those things. So if communication skills are an important point or an important thing that you want your students to be able to demonstrate, then your assessment should include some communication component. And I often do refer my students to Claire at the Writing Center to help them with that aspect of their writing. And I teach math, so it's important to have communication even in math. Next, we have associated with your course. This is really where the material can come alive. So you want your assessments to be directly related to what you've done in class. And so when you do that, it creates a greater connection to the students' lives and to the material. And finally, this last word here is agency. I think this is hugely important to give students some agency over the learning that they do. Give them some control, give them some choice. And if they can see that the assessment is meaningful to them and they have some stake in it, then they'll be able to demonstrate their knowledge much better. So I'd like to talk about 3 different examples of assessment activities that can fit into these categories and follow these principles. And a lot of people have started using more assessments like this during the pandemic teaching. And I'd love if we could bring those all back with us to the classroom when we move back in person. So first of all, self-assessment and reflective writing. So this is a great way to, again, give students agency over their own learning journey. Let them see what they know and see how they've developed and look at their goals. So one way is to have just simple questions. They could even be true, false, or multiple choice that students can try and instantaneously know how they did, understand whether they were right or wrong. These could be things that are incorporated into the lectures with various technology, or just a few questions each week, just some thought questions for people to think about. And you want these to highlight the key, most important learning outcomes so that students know, okay, I do understand this, I am on the right track. Or if they don't get it right, where did I go wrong? What misconception is this confronting? Generally, these questions would be completely ungraded, but they should, as a diagnostic, prepare students to do well on similar assessments that are graded, or you could have them be graded as their own. And second, the idea of reflective assignments where students actually write about their own learning. Having students get this metacognitive piece where they think about their own thinking is a really great way for students to develop their own learning goals and practices. So lots of ways you could do this. You could have these integrated with other assignments or as separate assignments, and have students maybe take an important course concept and explain it in language that a non-expert would understand. That demonstrates a really different depth of knowledge. Or describe a problem that they had struggled with earlier in the term but now understand, and what made them make that connection or come to that understanding. They could even talk about their own motivation for choosing this major or taking this course, and near the end, maybe think about whether they achieved their goals for their course and what they're going to do differently going forward. So having students actually reflect and think about their own learning can be really valuable, and again, give them some agency over their role, their important role in this learning process. As learners are online, they're generally have to be a little more independent. Next, we have this idea of assignments and projects. These are really great. And again, with the agency, giving them some choice of what questions to do or what topics to look at, so that the students can make sure that they're doing something that's actually important to them and meaningful and interesting to their life or to their program or to just their interests. You can also make it connected to the local area where you are. So refer to specific material that you talked about in lecture. If there was maybe an interesting discussion on a course discussion board, have people follow up on that or do additional thoughts about it. Or you could also relate things to the news or the city where you are, whatever is going on in the students' lives or in the world at the time, you can have students incorporate that into your assignments. And that can be really valuable, again, to see the relevance of the course material to the world in which they live. Authentic tasks are really, really important as well here. So something maybe that they would have to do in the workplace. In a math course, maybe create and document a spreadsheet to solve some kind of problem, but then also write up the conclusions from it. So not just the work, but actually the justification and put that into a report. Or you could even have kind of a multi-stage assignment where there's multiple steps and they build on top of each other. So perhaps the students could do some kind of topic proposal, obtain some data to analyze it, draft a report, and then maybe do a presentation. And with online, it's really nice that you could have pre-recorded presentations so that gets rid of the necessity for synchronous communication. And doing online presentations is definitely a skill that's going to be useful in the workplace going forward. So I know I've talked about some math-related examples, but I know faculty in other areas have done really, really neat assignments and projects, having students contribute 1 page each to a book that was then created for the course as a whole, and other really, really interesting things that folks are doing. Lastly, part of the summative assessment is thinking about a final exam, but the days of a closed book, time-limited, proctored exam were not something that we could do during the pandemic. So we have lots of different possible alternate formats that we could use. But the purpose of anything like this is to get a summative assessment of how much the student has learned throughout the term and the depth of that knowledge. So one way to adapt this is to have maybe an open book or a take-home exam with either not as much limited time or not as much limit on the materials that they can access. Again, this is more authentic. In the real world, you never have to have a bunch of stuff memorized. You can look something up if you don't know it. And so having exams that replicate that experience can be a more authentic experience. And so it's important to have some questions that are fairly straightforward and some that are more challenging, that stretch the student's knowledge and challenge them, and definitely some questions at a higher Bloom's level. So if you're allowing students to consult their notes, which is great, then maybe you don't want to ask so many questions that are just memorizing or remembering facts, but how we can interpret those, how they can apply to something different, how you can take that and analyze it or critique or create something new. And you can do that when you have more time and more resources that the students can consult. Another example is an oral exam. So these are something that are fairly common in some places, not very common in some places. And I love oral exams as a way to check the level of students' understanding. You can learn so much about the depth of a student's knowledge in a 15-minute conversation, maybe even more than you can learn from a 2.5-hour closed book exam, because you can really plumb the depths. You can poke at misconceptions and make sure that the student really understands. And it's an interactive learning experience as well as an assessment. So I love to ask students to define course concepts, evaluate things, advantages and disadvantages, compare two different things, or discuss the process for something. Or you could use an oral exam in tandem with a written assessment and have a student explain their solution to a problem that they've already presented. So that's a nice way to, again, see how deep their understanding goes. You could ask how something would change if some input changed, or you can also see how well the student understands their own work that they've done. So these are some alternate assessment formats that can be used for final exams, and we can bring those back into the classroom with us. So lastly, just my kind of key takeaways. Whenever you're thinking of an assessment in any course, keep these principles in mind, that they should be authentic, something meaningful, something that the student can realistically do, aligned with your goals for what you want them to learn, and give the student some agency in that assessment And we have these three kind of points at which assessment occurs throughout the term: diagnostic, formative, and summative. And actually the examples that I've given kind of fit into that. So self-assessment and reflective writing as a diagnostic, assignments and projects as a formative, and maybe an alternate format exam being open book or an oral exam as a summative assessment. So that is everything for me. Thanks very much, and I'll hand it back to David.
Thanks very much, Diana. So a reminder about the Q&A, if you want to take the chance to take your opportunity to plumb the depth of Diana's knowledge of what she was talking about there. So next up, I'd like to turn the floor over to Roland.
Hi everyone, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks, David. Hi everyone, thank you for having me. What I want to do today is just talk about what went into virtual lab design over the last year. I was one of many lab instructors during spring 2020 who had to transition physical in-person labs into the virtual environment. And so what I wanted to do today is talk about some of the thoughts that went into that design and some of the lessons I learned, and maybe you can learn from that experience. Just to set the stage, why do we do lab work? There's a generally accepted wisdom that labs add value by engaging students with the real-world aspects of the field. In my background, it's engineering, but of course it applies in the sciences as well. The idea being that there are some practical skills, things like pipetting, soldering, working with oscilloscopes, or other physical equipment that are important skills to have when working in that field. Moreover, labs, of course, allow students to see the real-world effects of the systems they're working with. So students might learn some sort of theory in their courses and then see the imperfections of that theory when applied to the real system. Of course, more recently, it has been more commonly held that labs also motivate students to learn. That is, it provides something interesting and fun for students to do while still engaging with the learning goals. This is a nice wisdom to hold, and it's a central philosophy for designing labs. But at the end of the day, this is a pretty high-level objective. So about 20 years ago, the American Accreditation Board sought advice for finding some more precise goals, objectives, to help in designing labs. They came up with 13 objectives, and I'm not going to go over all 13. Some of them have a lot to do with the Bloom's taxonomy that was presented by Diana just in the previous presentation. What I will talk about is just three slightly more high-level goals that are still precise enough to discuss. The first is instrumentation skills. Students need to learn practical skills and techniques and tools and have developed the required skills to work in their field of question, the required physical skills to work in their field of question. And I've mentioned some of those already. Another important skill, once you've collected your data, once you've performed some sort of computation or analysis, is the ability to interpret that data effectively. And in particular, using whatever model, mathematical model, probabilistic model, even logical model, whatever framework of thought the student has learned in their course, interpreting the data effectively, even when it's not a perfect model of reality. And I'll put that under modeling. Finally, teamwork and collaboration. And that's self-explanatory as to its significance in engineering, my background, where in the industry, it's very important to work in teams. But now in the modern age, as research has become more and more interconnected, interdisciplinary, and groups work even across institutions in research, collaboration is becoming more and more significant. And so it's important to have that as an objective as well for practical fieldwork or lab work. Now, these objectives tend to come a bit for free in person. We take them almost for granted when designing labs. But in the virtual setting, these are really hard objectives to meet. It's not quite clear how to meet each and every one of them. With regards to instrumentation and modeling, they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Modeling, of course, referring to the interaction with the real world and interpreting that data, while instrumentation is your actual physical interaction. How do you interact with that real world? Instrumentation skills are really hard to replicate in remote and virtual labs. As an example, you might, for example, record the lab being performed in the real world or a field experiment being performed in the real world and just provide the data to students. At the end of the day, the only tools the students are working with is the video player, right, to see the lab happen. Even if you have an immersed virtual reality, which could be really hard to implement in practice, students don't get that physicality, that physical experience with the tools that they're working with. It would still be artificial. So what can we do? Well, one of the things we can take, one of the approaches we can take is in the modern age, software is taking a much more prominent role, both in data collection and data analysis. With the advent of big data and AI, software is taking a much more prominent role. And in research, even in some fields that are not traditionally computationally driven, students are starting to have to know how to program even at the far end of the difficulty curve. And so what we can consider is start incorporating software instruments, data analysis tools, even programming at the far end of the difficulty curve into our labs and help grow and prepare students for the future of their fields. With regards to modeling, I discussed how you could record the real world, and in some cases, some of us did record the real world as it is and had students analyze the data that was prepared for them. But sometimes that is not actually a feasible option. Sometimes we do want the students to actually work with an actual system at hand. And one option here is to use simulation tools. The problem with simulation tools is that they are known to be, or thought to be, too perfect. But we can work around this. At the end of the day, the aspect of dealing with the real world, what is it about labs that teaches students about the real world is not so much that the system they're working with is the real world. Systems that students work with once they go into industry tend to be a lot larger, a lot more complicated. What's more important is the interaction between the student and the student's mental model of the world, whatever theory they're working with, and the simulated model, the presented model to them, whether that be a physical instrument or an actual simulation. And so when we go virtual, we have the ability to change this free variable, this simulated model, to be as big, as complicated as we want, or as simple as we want. This means we can tune it to any teaching goal we like, and even consider scenarios that are otherwise impossible, such as landing a rover on Mars, as presented there in that picture from the Perseverance rover, or even consider controlling an autonomous drone, which is what I considered when I was designing my labs. Students get the experience of interacting with a model that's sufficiently more complicated than what their mental model of reality is, and so they see the imperfections of their model and have to work within that imperfection. But they also get to deal with something really interesting and fascinating, and it motivates them to learn. If done well, students can experience the real world effects and actually be motivated to learn more of the course content and maybe go further in their fields. It can be hard to implement well, but for over the last 1 year, a lot of us have gone through that process. And so I would argue we've gone through and surpassed the biggest hurdle, which is this implementation. Now, I've talked about instrumentation and modeling. The last thing I want to talk about is collaboration. Now, collaboration, I took a bit for granted. We take it, the way we often structure it is groups work in teams of 2, students work in teams of 2, and then they have some lab desk and they work on the lab together and produce a report. Usually that's how teamwork is set up in a lab room. What I want to present to you is one aspect that is often missed, and one aspect I think I missed, and certainly many of us may have missed or thought about after the fact. So, of course, hold your compliments for my artistic rendition of a lab room. On the left, we have Alice and Bob, who are asking a question in the lab. And on the right, we have Brooke and Cheryl, who are on the ball. They know what's going on in the lab, and they're just going through speed running the entire lab. Now, normally, a teaching assistant or a lab instructor might come and help the student on the left, Alice and Bob, but quite often in practice, what happens is because Alice and Bob share a common space with a common goal, a social presence with their peers, Brooke and Cheryl, they might just ask a question to Brooke and Cheryl and ask for help. And if Brooke and Cheryl are happy to help, they'll help out. And this is quite natural. Not a significant major introduction or icebreaker is required for this to occur. It almost happens spontaneously without us noticing as lab instructors or lab personnel. Online, Brooke and Cheryl disappear into the interwebs. And in principle, we could have a moderated discourse, a moderated community in which peers can interact with one another. And I tried to implement this. We had Piazza and we had Discord for communication. But at the end of the day, the ice breaking that happens almost naturally without our intervention just doesn't happen at all. That peer-to-peer social presence is important. The fact that there's a common space shared by students towards a common goal allows them to communicate directly without a significant intervention by teaching staff. And that, of course, can affect learning, because now Alice and Bob are relying almost entirely on the teaching staff for assistance. So having discussed some of these aspects of virtual learning and labs, we've implemented 1 year of this virtual content. And now as we go back in person, we have the opportunity to blend this content to produce better learning outcomes. We know we can take the advantages of virtual learning, being able to tune this presented model to students, being able to consider scenarios that are otherwise impossible for students to experience, whether it be resources or because of the safety issues associated with those systems, with the advantages of in-person learning, the social presence, common social presence that appears because students share a common space towards a common goal. And of course, being able to work with physical instruments. So in conclusion, what I wanted to leave today with is a few questions to ask ourselves and our peers and colleagues about labs. Are we incorporating modern instrumentation as well as we could? Are we incorporating the new tools and software analysis and data collection, system identification, as well as we actually could in our labs? Can we leverage our newly developed virtual content? Can we consider simulating much more complicated systems or presenting much more complicated models because they are virtual, while taking advantage of the physical aspects of collecting data? And finally, do we take as seriously the intergroup collaboration as we do the intragroup collaboration? More broadly, as we go back in person, do we see the effects of the social presence that happen in practice, but we took for granted, and now we are presented with the fact that we have lost them over the last 1 year? Thank you for listening to my talk, and I'm interested to have a warm discussion about these topics.
Thanks very much, Roland. At one point, you were singing a song that I know Diana would be happy to hear when you were mentioning blending as we come back on campus, because the teaching fellows are driving a blended learning project for the return to campus, across the whole university. So glad to hear that. That was very interesting. So next, I'd like to turn the floor over to let's see, make sure I get the names right. Travis, Noor, and Davina. So take it away, Travis.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for having us today. It's an honor. I am just going to share my screen. Could everyone see the presentation mode?
Yeah, we could see it.
Yeah, it's good.
Perfect. Once again, thanks for having us. Great topics. I see a lot of connections between what was spoken earlier by our previous panelists and some of the things we work on at Knowledge Group. We are, as David said, an instructional guidance system, a formative assessment tool that also helps teachers not just measure student understanding throughout the school year, but also use this to adjust their own instruction and reflect on their own practice. And we're widely used across a number of districts across North America. Today, however, we're going to be talking about not the core tool, but really how COVID has impacted our workplace, what resulted of that, and how we had to rethink our paradigm of how we view work and the place of work. It's also, we're going to be talking about, as we are a company that supports teachers, how has COVID impacted the ability for teachers to come together and collaborate, and what Knowledge is doing as a result of COVID, but also things we're going to do beyond this period. And to really present these two portions of our topic, invited to Knowledge teammates, Noor, who is our Director of People and Culture for the first half, and Davina, our Product Manager for the Teacher Experience. I'm now going to hand it over to Noor to cover the first piece.
Thank you, Travis. Hello, everybody. So I will start off by showing you a few images that will take us back down memory lane, pre-COVID times. So we all know how much we hate this. So, you know, the commute, and then Travis, the next slide. And then the cubicles. So this, you know, this is this kind of what we're going back to? I can honestly say that looking at these images, I'm taken back to a place where I felt exhausted and like a zombie. The commute day in and day out, the stacked up cubicles. So there's many practical things that are telling us that it doesn't necessarily make sense for us to go back to this world completely. Now there is benefits to being in the office for sure, but there are also benefits to the alternative. More and more companies were focusing on adopting a remote culture during COVID-19. So if you really think about it, it's kind of similar to the agrarian society where home is almost both a place of work as well as a place of family. You work on the farmland and you come home and your home is right there as well. So we at Knowledge Hook, we took inspiration from that, and we're working towards building a culture where it's okay for your family member to interrupt you in a meeting, or your kids maybe rolling around under your office desk while you're working. We're focusing on a culture of flexibility, autonomy, work-life balance, encouraging families to interrupt and come say hello in a meeting, for example, or for employees to know that it's okay to interrupt a meeting because a family member really needs you. So we really realized that because of COVID-19, the boardroom culture has interrupted our homes. So we have to now be flexible in how we operate as businesses. So, you know, the thing is we all work to make money, to do things for and with our families and spend time with our families. It's for that freedom. So we wanted to create a culture where we truly allow employees to do that and be there for their families and have that freedom and flexibility while they're earning a living in a job that they really love. So one of the ways we are doing this is through giving employees a sense of purpose instead of micromanaging them. Many companies started thinking about tools to track employee hours when we started working remotely. They were operating from a place of fear because of one bad case and designing things for the extreme cases, using tools to track employee input. So we at Knowledge Hook decided to take a bit of a different approach, and we are trying to focus on empowerment instead of micromanagement. So my next slide is going to give you an example of a problem that almost all organizations face at some point, whether it's remotely or in the office. So it's a struggle of staying focused on the customer experience. How many of us have felt overwhelmed with the number of buttons and features on a remote control? I can honestly say that I've never made use of all the buttons on a remote control. It just looks overwhelming to look at sometimes. Now, I'm sure many smart engineers went into building this remote control that you see on the slide, but it feels cluttered and complicated. So at some point, they lost sight of the customer journey and the customer experience. Now, on the other hand, you see the iPhone, which upon being launched allowed customers to do so much more, made the user experience easier and much widely adoptable. So this is a great example of how organizations struggle to stay focused on that customer experience. So this happens in almost every organization, no matter if you're working from the office or if you're working remotely. So if you're an organization, you have a lot of people that are constantly trying to work together to create that customer experience. And while doing that, it's very, very often very easy to lose focus on the customer themselves. So with remote culture, I can only imagine that this problem is getting worse. So now we really need to take care of and worry about that customer journey. One group that's tackling and tried to solve this problem that we took inspiration from is Airbnb. So what they did is at the forefront of their offices, they created storyboards. So as soon as you walk into their office, you see storyboards of the customer's journey. We honestly really love that idea of honoring that customer's journey. Now, in the remote culture, we will not have access to our offices. So since the desk is a new office, how do we take this culture of the user journey storyboards? So what we did is we took inspiration from that Airbnb journey as well as the Pokemon Fortnite type of cards, and we created something of our own. So we built our own economy of collectible cards of the user journey, and we're shipping them to all of our employees with a binder. These cards will speak to all of our stakeholder and user journeys. Along with the cards, we're also trying to focus on the employee engagement piece. So things like shout outs, celebrating milestones, teams can thank each other through these cards. One of the problems this also solves is that there's a lot of passionate people that put a lot of work and passion into and go above and beyond in what they do. This idea, that people put so much heart into what they do and then it kind of just disappears. So now we have these cards that represent their work. If you really think about it, the black binder that you see where the cards will go, it's like an album. So an album usually has memories with pictures. So this is our version of that, the memories of people's work. So this is something that they can have on their desk, as well as, let's say, somebody is no longer with the organization. They have this album with all these memories of their work with them. Now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Davina, who's going to talk about some of the challenges that are happening in the workplace for teachers.
Thanks, Noor. So in addition to how we think about ideas for our internal team, today we're also going to be sharing how we think about experiences for our main user, teachers. When we think about our teachers and the space that they used to go to connect with your peers, to learn and share new ideas and best practices, what were these spaces pre-COVID? They were staff rooms and conferences. But for the past year or so, these physical spaces were no longer accessible. So where did teachers go? How did they connect with their peers, and how did they discover new ideas? We launched the Community of Practice, a virtual conference for teachers to connect with speakers and other teachers that they would have met at conferences. The Community of Practice is a space where passionate speakers not only talk about math, but they also share how teachers can build on their instruction, the kinds of strategies that teachers can introduce to their students in the classroom when it comes to tackling problem solving, when it comes to learning math. How do we redefine how students think about and learn math? And these conferences happen on a bi-monthly basis, so the connections that teachers make here and the sharing of ideas continue to grow throughout the year. Now, the second piece that we had to solve was the interactions in a physical school setting. How do we solve for that? Now, imagine if we can combine the classroom and the conference. What will this look like? Travis, do you want to show that? Okay, and so enter Teachers Lounge. We wanted to bring the community to teachers and create a seamless experience between our software and these interactions in the physical world. And so I'm going to share with you some of our Teachers Lounge mock-ups, and this is a sneak peek of what we're going to be launching soon. So on to the next slide. Awesome. And so when teachers log into their classroom, this is their classroom management page. They can also enter Teachers Lounge. From here, teachers can attend live community of practice events, or they can fuel their curiosity and explore new ideas and stories that are shared in this space. And that's on the next slide. And so if you're curious to know what are some of the examples of topics and themes when it comes to math, here are a few. Empowering students, fostering equity in the classroom, math and children literature, and managing anxiety in math class and in life. And when it comes to the impact stories, these are stories told by the everyday teachers who want to share about how they use technology in the classroom. What are their versions of teaching strategies that they use in their instruction? What are some of their students' aha or wow moments that they witness when they see their students learning math or overcome a learning obstacle? And these stories are powerful and are important because teachers anywhere can resonate with and connect with these stories, because they may also be seeing some of these moments in their classroom and in their own experiences as well. Now, post-COVID, as teachers shift to, when they return to the classroom, when they return to staff rooms and conferences, what happens then? We believe that the future of communities, the future of teacher collaboration and interaction will have to include online experiences. And companies like Knowledge Hook are taking really big bets on this belief that there will be a third space for teachers to meet and exchange ideas. And that's where we're integrating these elements into our software through the Teachers Lounge, so that the community of practice, the impact stories, the classrooms, they're right here at the teacher's fingertips. And there we are. These are just some of the ideas of how we creatively go about solving some of the problems for our internal team, for our customers during COVID and beyond, and some of the people and ideas that we're also inspired by. On behalf of our team, I'd like to thank the audience for attending today. I'd also like to thank the University of Waterloo for providing us a platform for us to share ideas that we're, of course, really passionate about. And I'll turn over the next portion to Q&A.
Thank you, Davina. Thank you, Noor. And that's back to you, David.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I think, you know, the thanks should be going in the other direction. Thank you for being here and sharing those really interesting thoughts with us. We've got some questions that have come through. You know, I'm going to cluster them a bit. I'm getting a bit of help in the background. It's coming pre-distilled a little bit for me into my feed, but I will try to distill them a little bit further. And I'll just say right off the top that all of the questions come with praise for the talk, you know, the presentations that we had. So I'm going to sort of leave those aside and let's just take those as read. They all were really interesting and informative things, and I should think just the nature of the questions will make clear that people were intrigued by what they heard. And rather than going, I mean, obviously the questions are showing up in my feed here as in the same order as the speakers, but I'm going to mix them up a bit just so it doesn't seem too formulaic. And I'll start with a question for Diana. It's come through a couple different times in a couple of different ways, but you know, I think that in general, people were intrigued by your alternative assessment ideas and thought, wow, those are great. And I think there may be some teachers of large classes in our audience today wondering, how scalable are they? And what do you do if you don't have enough TAs? And what do you do if you try to do, for instance, oral exams with TAs? Have you ever tried that? And how do you ensure sort of fairness and things like that? And what are some of the challenges? So if you could just take that as an opportunity to share some thoughts with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. Yeah, scalability is a huge issue with any kind of more authentic assessment because it can take a bit more time. And I have taught large classes as big as 900, and you can't do oral exams with 900 students the same way as you can when you have 50 or so. So for oral exams, one thing that you could do, and I do know someone who's done this, is have it be a follow-up to a written exam, and you don't necessarily examine everybody. So you could take a sample and everyone knows that they might be examined that way. And so they hopefully prepare and are prepared to answer those questions. And I do know someone else who's used TAs to help administer those oral exams. And in that case, you have to be a little bit careful about calibrating. So the difference between graders would be tricky to maintain that. So having some training for the TAs beforehand, having some practice where everybody watches a video of someone and grades them and then calibrates it so that work can be distributed amongst more people. And I've helped 2 different instructors at 2 different institutions do that, help train their TAs. So that's one way that you can scale, either by doing a sample or having recruiting others to help. In terms of the project, I think it's so valuable to do it that I would say try it at the absolute limit of what you think you can do. You can have group projects. And so groups of 3, maybe 4, maybe even 5 students, you can get some teamwork skills. As Roland was saying, those are valuable skills to build as well. And then have the students be accountable to each other by having the group members evaluate each other as well as part of that component, so that we don't have a situation where one group member does all the work for everyone else. Again, most of the time that doesn't happen. When it does, it can be really frustrating for the students though. And so having some kind of mechanism to make the students accountable to each other, that can cut the number of projects you have to mark in 5. So you can really I think it's so valuable to do it. And of course, some things just won't scale that well. You know, if you have 1,000 students, you can't have a project like that. But you could have some authentic component of some assessment. It doesn't have to be a whole project, but it could be one question on an assignment, which is, you know, take something in the news and see and describe how the course material applies to that. That's something that can be graded relatively easily. Or you could even have a peer grading system where students actually see responses from, say, 5 other students and grade those, and then students are getting graded by each other. And so there's lots of systems out there for peer grading, which scales really well because the more students you have, the more graders you have. That can be nice as well for them to see each other's work and work collaboratively. So thanks for the question. Very, very good practical question to think about.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to do these questions in a bit of a deliberate order here because they're turning in the direction of another big concern for several questioners. And so this one's for Claire. And so the question is, you know, you mentioned trying to handle inequities of various sorts. And one of the ones that you mentioned in passing was the speed and bandwidth for the internet access. And so do you have some successful strategies, or what did you do to try to create writing communities in the face of those kinds of challenges?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the writing communities happened in a number of different platforms. So the ones for grad students and faculty happened in Learn, and they were more synchronous, although we have volunteer-led writing groups happening in different disciplines and different labs across campus. And so there's lots of different opportunities for folks to connect with each other. We haven't set this up yet, but one of the ideas for helping create writing communities when bandwidth and location is an issue is to think about partnerships, so maybe pairing people up so there's a smaller group, or having something that's more asynchronous where people are exchanging work and giving feedback on each other's work in a more asynchronous kind of way. So those would be some of the ideas that might be useful.
You know, having read a few too many novels about writing workshops and life in English departments, I think that the asynchronous idea might take some of the snark out of the writing workshops for sure. Yeah, that's. Thank you very much for that. I think really there's a question here for Roland that's along a similar theme. I mean, I know I wasn't going to pass along a praise, but there was some high praise for your art, by the way, when you were talking about the teamwork. And you know, a couple of people had questions about, you know, challenges with the remote environment and creating teams. And so have you got any advice or experience with some of the platforms that are out there that are designed for creating social connections in a remote environment? And are they useful for lab-based courses?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I've tried a few things. Of course, the difficulty, so there's some, I came from a sort of advantage standpoint, which is that in engineering, you have a cohort system. And so there are some natural teams that do form. So there's a bit of a bias in what answer I'm going to provide here. But even still, what I found is that what I did try is I tried to create a moderated community using actually what is really a gaming software. Discord is a community software for gamers, and what I tried to do was had students actually enter channels where they can work together, creating a moderated voice community that I also joined, and just had them try to talk to each other as well as our TAs and staff and myself. It wasn't as effective as I had hoped. And there are other solutions, like of course Piazza is more commonly used these days, and students are quite engaged on Piazza, and they will go out of their way to talk. Not as much as when I was undergrad. I think the students of this generation are much more engaged online, so that worked out really well. What is more important, I think, is being proactive to find the students that are not engaged, and that's actually the real difficulty. There are, when you are online, it is really difficult. It's very easy to lose track of students because they'll just go on radio silence. And unless you have a mandatory synchronous aspect, which has its own access problems, as discussed by Claire, of course, you're going to lose track of students. And so what I found is if you're not synchronous and you can't use breakout rooms, which is probably in my opinion, probably a very good solution for introducing students to one another, it's just being proactive to find the students and making sure that they can talk to other students and reaching out and connecting with them. I'm fairly convinced after the last 1 year that and this is tying into another question I think that I saw, facilitating a good social presence online is extremely hard. It exacerbates the disparity between the outgoing students and the not so outgoing students, the introverted students, which is already there in person. And so, yeah, I'm not sure if there's a very good solution online.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so here's the oral exam question that's directed to Diana and Roland together. Somebody wants you to merge your ideas and talk about best practices for assessing students in virtual labs.
That is such a great question. I want to meet with Roland, discuss in a back room and come back. Yeah, I don't have an exact answer because I've never had a class with a lab component. So all the math stuff that I do is kind of cognitive domain rather than physical domain. But certainly having a lab and assessing them on lab skills is already authentic because that's a thing that they might need to do in the workplace. So that is definitely something that's already there. Yeah, that's such a good question. I don't have an immediate answer, Roland.
So
expertise might be more appropriate.
I'll give an answer there. Actually, I believe there are labs where oral examinations are part of the lab component. So there are quite commonly labs are done with reports at the end of the day, but there are demo components to labs, and you can replicate demos with an oral exam as an oral exam functionally, virtually. I didn't implement that because at the end of the day, I had, I think, 100 and something groups, and there is a difficulty there in terms of, as discussed, the scaling issue. But I think I would say that oral examination is much easier for a lab component to distribute amongst TAs because because the lab is so structured and the TAs are probably going to be quite expert at the lab because they'll perform them as well. There's a little bit more opportunity to distribute that across TAs. So I would say an oral examination component, or rather technically a demo component is what we would call it in the lab area, is appropriate and a very good idea, as opposed to what is more standard, which is a report style assessment.
I just had an idea. You could have students, if they're online, do a 1-minute video summary of their lab demo. You could just have a very restricted amount of time and then have them uploaded, and then students could watch each other's videos. And so the Bongo platform that's integrated with Learn makes that really, really easy for students to upload videos and then evaluate each other's. So totally do that.
There you go. That's a good idea.
And then make it all asynchronous to avoid snark of the evaluation, as I was just talking over with Claire. No, that's good. Thank you. I don't know if it's just me seeing some overlapping themes here. So this next question, I'm just going to not try to paraphrase it. I'm just going to read it. The Teacher's Lounge is such a great idea. We could think about this in a university environment for those niche courses where a faculty member may feel isolated in development of material. To build a community in Canada for those courses. They may even teach courses jointly across institutions for these smaller classes in a remote environment. Have you thought about this expansion?
Expansion into higher ed, you mean, or?
I think that's I think we're not asking you to give any secrets about your business.
No, not at all. It's currently at the moment, no, but I definitely think that there is opportunity, even as, we hear some of the challenges being discussed. I think there is an opportunity for something similar for higher ed, as the question articulated. In fact, just to give you a sense, we are thinking beyond you know, there's other functionality that we're looking at, road mapping, that allows for teachers to interact a little bit more amongst themselves. And, you know, there's probably going to be a proliferation of niche social media experiences that are targeting very specialized communities, professional communities, in this case, K-12 teachers, but I cannot see any reason why that would not be, you know, also valuable for higher ed. So it's a great question.
I mean, just as an idea, do any of our other panelists have thoughts about how feasible it is, or whether would be of interest to you to participate in something like that? If not, it's fine, but
I think stuff that grows organically is going to have more buy-in. So like if there's, you know, if your department has a weekly check-in or something, piggybacking on that. And actually the writing cafes that Claire mentioned, those are really neat. There's just sort of people that are on a call together and they don't talk and they have their cameras off, but they know that they're all there together. So the feeling of being together with someone really kind of motivates. But yeah, I'm not saying it won't work, of course, but it would have to be kind of something that they come to organically. I think that would be beneficial in that way. Yeah, just providing a platform and letting people come to it.
Dana, you make a great point. These things conceptually are great, but in order for them to work, there has to be this organic adoption, which, you know, takes time and thoughtful execution and design.
okay, thank you. So here's somebody said, okay, well, I'm going to be the one to ask this. I mean, a lot of people have been thinking about this, but do any of our panelists, I think this is just a general question, but does anybody have any comments on the remote environment and what to do about the temptations and the rise in academic integrity problems that come with trying to do assessments in a remote environment? Yeah, and so there's a suggestion here. Should we start the course with some ground rules on assessment to include expectations, when one should consult, and so on? But so I think that's clearly a good idea. But does anybody have any thoughts that'll elaborate on that or that go in another direction?
I have a whole lot to say, but I can let someone else go first. Maybe no one's jumping. So I think part of it is the way that assessments are designed. If you're asking students to do something really hard, that's busy work and meaningless, that has a high weight on it in terms of how much it contributes to their overall grade, what do you think is going to happen? That's going to be a high temptation to cheat. Whereas if you ask students to do something that's meaningful, going to benefit them in their careers, reasonably achievable, and has sort of signposting, they've been prepared for it for their diagnostic, through their diagnostic and formative assessments, and maybe there's more smaller things and they're not worth as much, all of those things are going to kind of create the conditions where cheating is less likely to happen. I don't think it's possible to prevent all cheating, and that it never has been and it never will be. But you want to create the conditions where that temptation is lessened, because the assessments are inherently valuable to students. And again, like having them reflect on their own learning, it's impossible to cheat on that. There's no way to cheat on your own thoughts. So having assessments that are, again, testing those kind of higher levels of learning in an authentic way, and with relating to your own unique experiences, is really a way to sort of, again, you can't prevent everything, but to get around that and to reduce the temptation, because most students would probably rather do something meaningful than solve a bunch of, the same math question over and over again. And it's easier to cheat on those kinds of things than on something that's more personalized.
Well, I would just say as a professional philosopher that it is in fact possible to pretend to reflect. Right. So I have one final question that people have asked us to ask the panelists to take up in turn. And it's just this. Well, it's not just this, it is this. What's the most exciting development in your view resulting from the need to move to the remote environment for teaching and learning over the past year? So why don't we go in the order of the speakers? So that puts you on the spot first, Claire.
It sure does, but that's okay. So I think the most exciting thing for me has been maybe a shift in mentality around how we learn, and a willingness to adopt different technologies and different platforms. I think the what Diana was talking about too, which is in terms of blended and having this kind of like flipped approach, or Roland, I think, and Diana maybe, and David, you piped in about it as well, where people are, consuming or learning about certain things, maybe alone, and then coming together to talk about things in a more synchronous way. So this combination of asynchronous and synchronous, which is really exciting as well. So I think there's a greater openness, I think, to doing things differently, and that ties, of course, to what Travis and his team were talking about as well.
Great, thank you. Diana.
I was going to say basically exactly the same thing as Claire. Like this challenge to, this is the way things have always been done. There's no way I could possibly assess students without a 3-hour 60%, 80% final exam. We've proven that you can do that. And it's not perfect, of course, there's problems, but the challenge of we can't say that it cannot be done, because it can. We did it. It wasn't perfect, but it happened. And so that learning can happen maybe more independently, and assessment can be more active, and time spent in class can be actively engaging with material rather than just passively receiving information. All of those things are huge benefits, I think, just again, shaking things up and making people see that there are other ways to do things than the way things have always been done. And we shouldn't be so eager to just rush back to exactly the way things were before. We should bring some of these new things with us when we go back into the classroom. Thank
you. Roland.
In an attempt to not provide the exact same answer as Diana and Claire, I think it's giving us, I'm excited for an opportunity to actually reevaluate how we go about education in next year. So not simply just changing things, but also being able to compare and contrast the way we do things in the past, what's beneficial, and what we can actually consider changing for the future. And so blending things together, which I guess we have already discussed, but yeah, I would say that is the most exciting thing for me.
Okay, Travis and team, just repeating the question, what's the most exciting development that's sort of been driven by the move to remote learning over the last year?
I think Eunice is going to chime in for us.
I'll share back the team. Yeah, I think for us, it's really thinking about, when teachers switch to a remote space, for the most part, a lot of the feedback we heard from teachers was that these changes are happening probably the day before or the week of, and they have to switch their routine, switch their habit almost instantaneously. And it's something that they're not used to, especially even for new teachers that are coming in and teaching for the first time in a new year in the remote world. And so the most exciting part for us is really thinking about how do we bring these experiences to teachers. I talk about bringing the community to the teachers, bring this to their fingertips. How do we bring these things? Because the one thing that teachers are really craving for is these interactions, these water cooler talks that they get to have in the staff rooms, these connections that they get to make at the conferences, being able to learn and hear from different speakers. But the fantastic thing about virtual experience is that even with a conference, you can be anywhere in the world and you can hear from anyone. It's a virtual space, and there can be a cap on the attendees as well, but there's also space for more people to attend and hear from others and share with one another. And so I think that's the most exciting part for us is thinking about what does this experience look like, not only in a virtual setting, but also sustainably after we come out of COVID, after we go back into the physical world. What would this look like, and how can we bridge the physical interactions and virtual interactions? So it's from us.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, and just picking up on that last theme, it does my administrator's heart. Now that I'm an administrator, it does it some good to think about all the money and greenhouse gases we will save by having more virtual conferences and virtual interactions and virtual collaborations. That's one more good thing, less directly relevant to teaching and learning, to come out of this. So I think the next thing is for me to turn it over to Charmaine, who will wrap things up for us. But thank you to everyone who is here today. I had a great time. Charmaine?
David, I'll join you. Claire, Diana, Roland, Travis, and your team, Noor and Daviana. Thank you. What a wonderful conversation. Really, really lively. You know, I agree with you that the whole push to blended learning fostered by the remote environment and actually the speed with which our community took it up, David. Um, that's brought a whole slate of new ideas forward. As you say, reevaluating education. Really love the lounge idea as well. And so interesting that you can take topics that are outside of a classroom curriculum topic, but still important for education of students, like diversity and how to foster diversity and care for diverse students in the classroom. Those are great water cooler topics that really need to bring people, given that there isn't a lot of representation in each of our schools, bring people together across different educational venues. And that ties in, I think, David, you were commenting on this, on the niche courses and having the ability for faculty members developing such niche courses to be able to share the experiences across institutions in Canada. And it's not just the faculty members. I mean, it's diversity also is diversity in students. So if you think about the sustainability file and topics related to sustainability that, might be a little bit more particular to be able to bring the students together who are taking these courses in small groups across various Canadian institutions. What a wonderful opportunity for them to learn from each other, share experiences. David, you did a fabulous job moderating the panel and bringing the questions forward. So I know how busy you are, so I'd like to thank you also for participating here today. Thanks very much, everyone, again, for your time. We usually end by the next Research Talks events, but this is the last for the academic year. So I'll say that we really look forward to seeing you at future Research Talks. And if you have suggestions, this is the first time in Research Talks that we've done one on teaching and learning. So if you have suggestions, this group in particular, for the future, love to hear from you. Connect with us through my office or through Janet's office. And in terms of connecting the speakers for the speakers today, if you have questions for them, we'll end with a slide that gives you their contact information. So thank you very much, everyone. I can't but say we've all had a tough time this year. I hope you all take time with your family and your friends, or as you can in August, to really unwind a bit. It's we've all built up resilience, but resilience needs a little downtime to actually sink in and help us through the next year. So please do enjoy the sunshine and get some holiday time in August. Thank you so much again, everyone. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, David. Have a good afternoon, everyone.